Hi, this is David Hildebrand, and this is a lecture on W.T. Stace's piece, Man Against Darkness. I want to begin with two quotes today. The first is from Leibniz, and his quote is, "This is the best of all possible worlds." And the other quote is, "Shit happens." And this I think I saw on a t-shirt in the 1980s. What's the difference between these two quotes? What's the different worldviews behind these two quotes? If you were to choose one of these quotes as the one that was closest to your own sort of view on the world, the view on things, which would it be and why? So here's a brief outline of what we'll go through in this lecture. We'll start by talking about the state of belief as Stace sees it and the causes for that. Mainly, this is a giant shift from teleological to materialistic or mechanistic explanations. He talks about the results of this shift, which lead to things like ethical relativity and a sort of sense of powerlessness, and he asks what can be done. He gives a couple of different ideas as to suggestions going back to religion or perhaps trying to invent a new religion. And he finally comes to two different illusions that human beings have lived by for most of recorded history, and the one that we can stick with and the one we have to get rid of. And he illustrates this by talking about the difference between a sham and a genuinely civilized being. And that will conclude the lecture. So what's the state of belief, according to Stace? What's the position that modern human beings find themselves in, spiritually, intellectually, according to Stace? Well, Stace really agrees with philosophers like Nietzsche, Sartre, Bertrand Russell, that there is a spiritual crisis. And he believes that the crisis stems from the belief that there's no real order or plan to the universe. There are random collisions of atoms, or there are accidental accumulations and mutations of stuff. So outside of what human beings make of things, nothing really has any structure, order, or meaning of its own. Shit just happens, period. And that's all we can really say about meaning or ethics in the world, at least as it is in itself. Now, this view is a 180-degree turn against thousands of years of human civilization. The idea that there is a universe which has a plan to it, whether that's the cycles of rebirth of the ancient Hindus, heaven and hell in Christianity, the afterworlds of the ancient Greek religions, all of these stories are older than we can imagine, and all of the stories agreed that the world has a plan and a purpose, even if we can't always see it. This is accepted as fundamentally true. It's accepted on faith. It is the ground of all other beliefs. And the world is not only orderly and purposeful in structure, it is good as well. There's a cosmic justice to the way things happen, again, even if we can't see it from our perspective. This is what Stace refers to as the essence of the religious vision. The question becomes, what caused humanity, or much of humanity, to turn away from this religious vision? In other words, what has caused people to lose faith in that earlier essential religious vision? The idea that there was purpose, structure, meaning to the world, that the world was good. And here I need to quote Stace at some length. He says, "There is a popular belief that some particular scientific discoveries or theories, such as the Darwinian theory of evolution, or the views of geologists about the age of the Earth, or a series of such discoveries have done this damage. The root cause of the decay of faith has not been any particular discovery of science, but rather the general spirit of science and certain basic assumptions upon which modern science, from the 17th century onwards, has proceeded. The real turning point between the medieval age of faith and the modern age of unfaith came when scientists of the 17th century turned their backs upon what used to be called final causes. The final cause of a thing or event meant the purpose for which it was supposed to serve in the universe, its cosmic purpose. What lay back of this was the presupposition that there is a cosmic order or plan and that everything which exists could, in the last analysis, be explained in terms of its place in this cosmic plan, that is, in terms of its purpose. One thing I want to emphasize in these ideas that Stace is advancing is that, again, it's not any particular theory, and we see a lot of conflicts, for example, between people who would like to teach evolution in schools and people who are very religious in a certain way and want to object to it. Darwin, evolution, these sorts of things are controversial. But what Stace is pointing out is that this general sort of movement from faith to what he calls unfaith doesn't happen because of any particular theory along the way. It is a general shift away from this idea that the world is orderly, from teleology, right, purposeful view of the universe, towards a view of the universe as being sort of a container for mechanistic causes and effects, right? There are no final ends, final purposes. In science, there are mechanisms, there are, of course, directions and vectors, but there's no ultimate purpose towards which everything is headed. There's no dramatic story in that religious or mythic sense. So in the earlier science, the earlier times when sort of pre-scientific revolution, there would have to be a purpose for everything. And the idea that this is the best of all possible worlds is Leibniz's sort of expansion on this idea that everything has a purpose. And this is not always a purpose we can see in the terrible tragedies that unfold around us, but everything must have a purpose. Voltaire, the author, the French author, parodies this in his novel Candide, and he ridicules the idea that all is for the best and this is the best of all possible worlds. And he just shows calamity after calamity after calamity. It's quite funny. So what is an example of a teleological final cause? How would we reason if we thought about things in that earlier way of thinking? Well, let's take something like the human eye. How would we explain the human eye? We would explain it by the fact that it helps us to see, or that it helps us to gather food, or that it helps us to fight off enemies. We explain the eye, in other words, in this earlier way of explaining the world, which I sort of hesitate to call science, by reference to the way that it helps the whole or the system it belongs to. Let's take another example. Let's take a simple example like Mary ran down the street. How would we explain that in a teleological way? We might say Mary ran down the street because she wanted to catch the bus. In other words, the goal explains the action. We might explain something like spring rain as saying spring rain is for the crops. Spring rain makes the crops grow, and that feeds us. Spring rain is for feeding us. Right? So you can see you have a picture of the whole universe organized towards certain very definite purposes. Now, as science develops and makes advances in all sorts of ways, technological, experimental, theoretical ways, it became unsatisfactory to people that we would try to explain things based on teleological purpose. They wanted to know, and we want to know now in contemporary life, what makes things work, how they work. We want to know what makes an eye actually work, what makes rain clouds gather in the first place. We want to know whether or not Mary's brain triggered her legs to run and how that all functions. We want to know mechanical causes behind the things that we're explaining. We think of nature as a kind of elaborate machine, and we want to know how it works. So an explanation that says that the eye is for seeing and that rain is for the crops just isn't good enough for post-scientific revolution scientists or for any of us today, or most of us, I should say. It's very hard to get along without mechanistic explanation. We want a different kind of explanation. Again, we want a mechanistic or material explanation. So the description of the world for scientists who prefer mechanical explanations, physicists such as Galileo or Newton, philosophers like Descartes, they see the world as full of atoms, right? Full of dead rocks pinging against each other in space, each having a certain mass, velocity, and direction, and that everything that could happen could be explained by natural laws, by mathematics, and the particular objects of those laws, which in the earliest days were atoms. So again, the dramatic point here is that this is a fundamentally different story being advanced by scientists in the face of the religious traditions which had existed before them and existed all around them, and in some cases this got them in trouble. The fundamentally different story that we are telling now and which they told then was, instead of seeing the universe as a teleological goal-directed universe, a pull from ahead, it was now more of a series of forces, a push from behind. Instead of thinking in terms of agency and action, it was thought of in terms of motion. Instead of being thought of in terms of destiny or fate, it was thought of in terms of compulsion or necessity. The shift that happens in this period is what Stace was describing before as the essence of the religious vision. This move away from that essence of the religious vision is what religion cannot survive. That is his main point in this article. He says, belief in final causes thus amounted to a belief that the world is governed by purposes, presumably the purposes of some overruling mind. This belief was not the invention of Christianity. It was basic to the whole of Western civilization, whether in the ancient pagan world or in Christendom, from the time of Socrates to the rise of science in the 17th century. The founders of modern science took the revolutionary step of consciously and deliberately expelling the idea of purpose as controlling nature from their new science of nature. They did this on the ground that inquiry into purposes is useless for what science aims at, namely the prediction and control of events. European man, or human beings, before Galileo, whether ancient pagan or more recent Christian, thought of the world as controlled by plan and purpose. After Galileo, European man thinks of it as utterly purposeless. This is the great revolution of which I spoke. It is this which has killed religion. Now, of course, we know from the history of the period that the rise of science and scientists as a rival authority in the medieval or the late medieval or the early Renaissance world was a political challenge to the established hierarchy which was dominated by the church. But more than that was at stake in terms of explaining the threat of this new scientific vision of the world. This change from the dominant view of the world at the time, from the teleological or purpose-driven world to the one that was being advanced by the material sciences, it led many people to believe that a moral chaos would result if this view of the world, this purposeful view of the world, was discarded. The result is that for those who need the older story, the one filled with purposes and drama, where everything has a purpose, where everything is part of a grand plan, morality becomes set adrift. And this was something that Nietzsche was chronicling in his work, The Gay Science. There's that famous passage, the God is Dead passage, where the madman runs down into the marketplace holding a lantern in the middle of the day, screaming, "Where is God? I seek God," and everybody laughs at him. Well, later on in that passage, the madman says, "What did we do when we unchained our earth from its sun?" So Nietzsche clearly sees the implications of modern, to his time, modern astronomy. He understands that right and wrong, good and bad are going to become unhinged when the structure of the world, the scientific explanation of the world, is radically changed. So all of the norms of morality, all of the norms of Christianity were tied up together in this cosmic explanation of the way things worked, and they were going to be put at risk by the scientific revolution. So the norms of morality become seen as just inventions of people, and they seem to be made up according to what our principles are, and they're not tied any longer to some ultimate permanent standard such as the story that's told in the religious text or the form of justice or piety if you go back to the ancient Greeks. They're just being invented according to the whims, the tastes, the desires of people. So this danger was moral chaos, and people worried that moral chaos would arise in the wake of the scientific revolution. And about this, Stace says, "If our moral rules do not proceed from something outside us in the nature of the universe, whether we say it is God or simply the universe itself, then they must be our own inventions. Thus it came to be believed that moral rules must be merely an expression of our own likes and dislikes. But likes and dislikes are notoriously variable. Good and evil," he writes, quoting the philosopher Thomas Hobbes, "good and evil are names that signify our appetites and aversions." So one consequence of this shift away from the cosmological picture and this loosening of the moral and religious structures, is the collapse of any common codes of morality that are seen as binding on everybody. And this is sometimes referred to as ethical relativity or ethical relativism. This is a view, ethical relativity is a view that holds that a belief that the world is purposeless leads to the belief that there's nothing more to being right than thinking you are. Right and wrong are simply relative to this person or this group or this nation. So as Stace puts it, no one any longer effectively believes in moral principles except as the private prejudices either of individual men or of nations or cultures. Every person has their own ethics. What's right for them is up to them. So you might think of some really outrageous examples, right? A culture that kills its firstborn daughters, right? But that's just their way. Or female genital mutilation is common in some parts of Africa, and it causes tremendous suffering, disease, and lifelong dysfunction. But it's not our place to judge, right? Or you might even think of, right, the way Americans use energy. I mean, at one point, America had 6% of the world's population and used 30% of its energy. But that's just the way we do things, and as long as no one can force us to consume less, there's nothing wrong with it. So all of these ideas are excused or rationalized by ethical relativism, and this is one possible consequence of the shift that Stace is talking about here. One second result or consequence of this shift is a loss on people's part of their own belief in their free will, a sense of powerlessness. I mean, Nietzsche worried about this as coming about because of religion too, but let's set that aside. But think about it for a second. If everything in the universe is made out of matter, and if all matter follows physical laws, then everything that we do or think has been caused somehow by a chain of events that was set in motion a long, long time ago. Our will cannot be free if the world is determined as science says it is, at least the science that Stace was thinking of at the time. There's much more chaos and indeterminacy as part of science now, but it's still hard to square those parts of science with the idea of a free will, and the debate continues. But this is at least one argument about the consequence of this shift from a scientific way of seeing the world towards ethical relativism. So to be clear, Stace believes that philosophers can make decent arguments against relativism and also against the idea that we don't have free will. But he thinks that the more important general consequence of the scientific worldview is that we've adopted a much more general and public acceptance of the idea that we don't have much freedom to change ourselves or change our world. So, in other words, even though philosophers can make these arguments, those ideas are not going to disseminate very widely. They're going to be complicated, nuanced arguments, and of course there's going to be debate among philosophers. But what we wind up with, he says, is a kind of fatalism and a willingness to blame things on forces beyond our control. So someone might say, I believe that I do what I do because of my upbringing. It's just how I was raised. You might hear that from time to time. Or they might say, listen, I can't do anything otherwise because it's in my genes, right? My genes are ultimately controlling me. They might say, right, I've learned about unconscious forces in psychology, and I realize that there are so many of them at work that most of the choices I make are due to them, and I don't even have access to them. So all of these are statements that people make who are explaining away their freedom rather than accepting responsibility for it, because they've accepted this deterministic scientific picture that they don't really have free will. And this becomes a very common way of accounting for our actions, explaining our actions. It is the language of disease, it's the language of dysfunction, it is the mantra of a culture that is addicted to therapy, right, in general. So the question becomes, what can be done? Well, Stace identifies two kinds of proposals that he thinks cannot work and proposals that he thinks are basically what we have to settle for. The proposals which can't work are, he cites, this idea that we should just sort of come back to religion, this idea of the bishops. He mentions bishops, the idea that we really need to return to religion, return to the grand story, the grand view of the world as purposeful. Stace thinks that this crisis is so unique and so global that it's really too far gone, and returning to religion, it's too late. The other idea is to create a new religion, and this has the same problem, because any new religion is going to be a new story with a purpose, and this is what we have moved past and cannot undo. So the general point he's making here about religion is that we're just too skeptical now. We are presuming a materialistic cause and effect world. We presume that the lack of order or the lack of meaning is written into the way things are. So the idea of religion is, he says, a sort of go back to sleep option. It's an opiate. Science cannot be the subject of our worship either, because science is not about values or ultimate purposes. So science cannot substitute for religion, although we see some movements like Scientology try to do that. What can we do? Well, all we can really do, Stace says, is we have to do two things. We have to face the truth, and we have to learn to live with it. By facing the truth, he means we have to realize that we are all we have. There's nothing outside us to help us. There's no values. There's no comfort. We need courage. We need honesty. We need to accept this truth. It's kind of cold comfort, and it doesn't give us a prescription as to what to do, but it is an important part of recovering from this shift. Pretending there's a grand story in the universe is not going to work any longer. Besides facing the truth, we have to learn to live with the truth. So as we learn to live with the truth, Stace says, well, think about learning to live with it in this sense. There are two illusions that human beings have gotten along using. One is he calls the great illusion, and the other is he calls minor illusions. The great illusion is the one we've been talking about this whole time. The idea that the universe is moral and good. It follows a wise and noble plan. That goodness is bound to win out someday in the end. And we have to learn, Stace says, we have to learn to live without this one. But there are other minor illusions that we need, we use, and we can keep. One is the nature of love. One is the fiction of patriotism or the fictions of fame. None of these need to be banished by scientific reasoning. These are all illusions. These and many more are illusions that make life livable, and we can keep them. Another way to understand this distinction between the great and the minor illusions and getting along without them is this distinction he makes between a sham civilized being and a genuinely civilized being. And he puts it this way. I can best explain the difference by a reminiscence. I remember a fellow student in my college days, an ardent Christian, who told me that if he did not believe in a future life, in heaven and hell, he would rape, murder, steal, and be a drunkard. That is what I call being a sham civilized being. On the other hand, not only could a Huxley, a John Stuart Mill, a David Hume live great and fine lives without any religion, but a great many others of us, quite obscure persons, can live decent lives without it. To be genuinely civilized means to be able to walk straightly and to live honorably without the props and crutches of one or another of the childish dreams which have, so far, supported men. So to briefly summarize, Stace has been seeking to explain the phenomenon that Nietzsche described, the deterioration of the plausibility of God and of religion. Stace explains it by showing how scientific explanation became everyone's everyday default method of explaining the world around them. And he explained that this way of seeing the world, of explaining the world, makes the religious way of knowing outmoded and untenable, unbelievable. This makes religious truths all the more unbelievable. Now, the especially hard to believe part of this is the idea that there is a plan. What will happen, he says, is that he doesn't expect religion to go away, but he believes that in order to stop misleading people and to creating this kind of, bifurcated consciousness, this kind of dual way of looking at things, religion has to adapt. It needs to adapt. It needs to become more plausible, because believing in the old-fashioned version of us is just too schizophrenic, if you will, to be healthy for us. So that's the end of the lecture. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I look forward to talking to you about it soon.